Welcome back everybody to our studies in Tsarist and Communist Russia. In this video we are going to talk about some of the political, domestic, local and military reforms under Alexander II, starting and highlighting specifically the emancipation of the serfs. The specification requires us to understand political authority and attempts at reform, Alexander II, emancipation of the serfs, and attempts at domestic and military reform. And so, in this line of argumentation, we're going to begin by thinking about the Emancipation Edict and the emancipation of the serfs, something that we touched on in the previous video, but then spend the majority of our time focusing on the causes of some of these major policy changes, which included, but was not limited to, the Crimean War. So, essentially, the Emancipation Edict of 1861 in Russia was a landmark event which essentially formally abolished serfdom and freed tens of millions of serfs. The reform had significant impacts in terms of socio-economic effects, and it is still subject to quite major debate. And so before the Emancipation Edict, we see that the idea of serfdom was this idea of slavery to an extent, where people were bound to the land that they worked, and they were bound to the landowners under feudal obligations. Now, after the Emancipation Edict was passed, approximately 23 million serfs were freed. And so while they gained personal freedom, we still think of the impact of the emancipation of the serfs in terms of their socio-economic situation, and this remained a little bit more precarious. So, for example, in terms of the abolition of the serfs, in terms of economic significance, one of the central features of this new Emancipation Edict was the use of land redistribution. So essentially, one of the features of the reform was that the land allotment to former serfs would essentially allow these serfs to have their own piece of land. But these allotments often came with the requirement that they make redemption payments, which of course was problematic. The serfs were required to pay for the land that they had received, and the land itself was of a particularly poor quality and was often insufficient for sustaining a family. And so these payments would often also stretch for decades and created long-term financial burdens. On average, the land allotted to these serfs were too small, as I said, especially with the payment being made to the state for as long as 49 years. According to some estimates then, up to 40% of the former serfs were unable to make their redemption payments in full, which of course, as you can probably imagine, would lead to even further economic hardship. And we can see that essentially in 1861, when we get the Emancipation Edict, the average amount of land that was granted to the serfs was roughly equivalent to 2.7 hectares or 6.6 acres. Now, the quality of this land was often very, very poor. So you might think, well, that's quite a lot of land, but in terms of its quality for being able to actually do agriculture, we see that it was typically insufficient for subsistence farming, which leads to difficulties in agricultural production. And so the initial expectation of the Emancipation Edict was to essentially try and lead to greater agricultural efficiency and to expand agricultural economy due to the increase in free labour and the improvement in productivity. But the outcomes were a lot more mixed. We see, for example, that there is in the short term limited productivity gains. There was not this substantial growth in the agricultural sector after emancipation. Many former serfs faced financial difficulties and lacked the resources to be able to invest in farming improvements. We can see that by the 1870s then, agricultural production did not see many significant increases. Grain yields per piece of land remained relatively stagnant. We see, for example, that between 1860 and 1880, the production of grain was only around that of about 10% between those two, between that 20-year period, which is below expectations given all of the other factors that you could think about. The demographic increase, for example, and the size of the population. You would expect a greater increase in grain production, but you don't see that. It lags behind all of the other increases and improvements in the economy. Now, while some peasants did quite well during this time period, many often struggled with land scarcity. And so this led to a significant rural to urban migration as peasants sought employment away from the agricultural sector and into the emerging industrial sector within the cities, contributing also to the decline in, or the slowing in the rate of grain production between 1860 and 1880. The emancipation also had an unintended consequence when thinking about land inequality. So while it granted land to peasants, it also allowed wealthy landowners to consolidate their holdings at the same time. So wealthier peasants were sometimes known as the kulaks, which we'll get to in future lessons as a label that is presented to them by Stalin most notably. These were able to buy land from those who were less well off, leading to a concentration of land in the hands of a very few number of individuals. By the late 19th century, then, there were definitely signs of significant land consolidation in the hands of an elite few. We can see that roughly by 1897, roughly 10% of the population in Russia was approximately approximately 50% of the land. This huge wealth inequality and distribution of land becomes more pronounced in certain regions, particularly in central Russia, where wealthier peasants and landowners dominated this agricultural landscape, but shows signs of just how significant this kind of inequality was and existed. And so the period following emancipation sees a gradual shift towards industrialization, but this shift towards industrialization is not an immediate shift. The state begins to promote industrialization in the 1870s, but the free labour force from the abolition of serfdom did not immediately result in a significant amount of industrial growth. This would lag behind, but would begin to increase at a greater rate. We see that the Russia's annual growth between 1861 and 1913 is roughly that of 4%, but will then start to increase even more at a much greater rate by post-1913, and then as we start to get into the First World War. Finally then, the emancipation also contributed to the growth of the cities, as you would probably imagine when thinking about industrial development. Urbanization was not as rapid as in other European countries. So, for example, in Britain in the 1700s, you see huge increases in populations in places like Manchester and Liverpool, specifically. In Russia, in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, they were not large compared to their counterparts in Western Europe, but you do see a sense of urbanization start to take place during this time. Finally, on this slide then, the emancipation did not satisfy the hopes and demands of the peasantry. We could probably conclude that if you get an essay question on whether or not the emancipation of the serfs was successful or unsuccessful, you would probably I would personally lean more towards unsuccessful, given the fact that it sort of had all the right intentions, or at least seemingly had all the right intentions, but did not lead to the major changes that the emancipation chalked itself up to try and achieve, if that makes sense. The hardship of freed serfs led to widespread dissatisfaction and ultimately lays the groundwork for the broader political movements that culminates in the revolutions of the early 19th century, the 1905 revolution and the two 1917 revolutions. And so in terms of its long-term impact then, over time the free labour force would start to emerge, or at least contribute to the emergence of a wage labour economy, especially in these urban centres. The shift is very slow, but it lays the foundation for future economic modernisation. And then finally, the emancipation contributes to a gradual shift in Russian society from a socio and political change, because peasants, who had been the majority of the population, start to take on new roles. This contributes to the fragmentation of the old system, the old feudal system, and the creation of what you could conceivably define as a new social order. And so fundamentally then, the next point I want to start making is in relation to a number of the social and political reforms that we see under the reign of Alexander II. Beginning first then with judicial reforms. There are a number of judicial reforms that we see during the reign of Alexander II. This represents a major change in terms of the contextual idea of Alexander's relationship to the Russian state and the Russian people. Before 1864, before the reforms of 1864, we see that Russia's judicial system was very inadequate, it was very inefficient, it was often very corrupt, it lacked independence, it lacked transparency, it lacked fairness, and it led to quite a lot of widespread dissatisfaction. And so one of the first major parts of this new reform, one of the central features of this reform, was the growth of an independent judiciary. Prior to the reforms, judges were heavily influenced by the autocracy, and legal decisions were often subject to political considerations. And this new system then aimed to establish a bit more of what we describe in politics as a separation of powers, a separation between the judiciary as a legal institution and all of the other political institutions, at this time being Alexander II himself, and then later would be things like the State Duma, for example. Judges were given lifetime tenure, which was designed to try and reduce external pressures, and they were also no longer subject to dismissal by the whims of the government without a certain degree of due process. Under the old system, the legal system was based heavily in favour of the nobility and the aristocracy. Nobles would enjoy very special privileges, their legal cases would be handled very differently, and the reforms of 1864 sought to ensure that citizens would be treated more equally before the law. It introduced the principle that all individuals were subject to the same laws and the same legal processes, including that of the nobility and the clergy. This comes along with a greater public transparency. We see that trials were now conducted in open court, and the public would be able to attend, which not only fostered transparency, but also helped to try and create a certain degree of trust within the legal process. The press were granted greater access to report on legal cases as well. And then one of the major reforms is this idea of the trial by jury. These were introduced for criminal cases. A jury would be composed of landowners or merchants or other members of the local community. The inclusion of regular citizens in legal proceedings then would help to bring a sense of fairness and objectivity. In terms of a sort of limitation of this particular reform, you might argue that the jury trials were initially limited to criminal cases only, and there still existed both political cases and religious cases. So it wasn't like how we have our system of crime and criminal jurisdiction and civil jurisdiction. There was criminal cases, but there were also political and religious cases, and they were excluded from this jury trial system, as the Tsarist government wanted to maintain a tight control over political dissent. So you can sort of see that there is this attempt to break away from the basic principles of autocracy, but then there are still ideas of autocracy imbued in every single reform that is made. Defendants would then be allowed since 1864 to have a certain degree of legal counsel. Lawyers were allowed to represent citizens in court, and there was this idea of the defense attorney, if you will, the defense solicitor, if we were to use the sort of westernized language. And then finally, there are sort of two parts that we can see here as well. There is the codification of laws, just modelled on things like the Western legal systems, such as the French Napoleonic Code, for example. And there's the reorganisation of the courts. This was reorganised to a more tiered structure with a sort of district court. You have circuit courts, and you also have what were known as volost courts, which were created to handle cases in rural areas and ensure that the legal system was more accessible. And so if we were to analyse these judicial reforms then, you could say that they initially were hailed as a major step towards modernising Russia's legal system and bringing it in line with the sort of westernised European practices. And so on the one hand, you see that there is an initial success. They were popular also among the liberal elite, the intelligentsia, who praised the increase in fairness. Foreign observers also viewed these reforms positively because, of course, these were the kinds of reforms that existed in the Western world for a great many years prior. But there were problems. Despite their initial success, the judicial reforms would face significant limitations in the long term. We see, for example, that political cases still continue to be handled separately from the new judicial system. Trials involving political descendants, revolutionaries, individuals that were just critical of the Tsarist regime were conducted under the old, the arbitrary, the behind closed door kind of system. These cases lacked transparency, they lacked fairness, and they were essentially very different to the new system that was attempting to be built during this time. We also see that over time, the nobility and more conservative groups began to resist and resent the reforms, the idea of equal treatment, and it brought to the surface the clear social unrest and social inequality that still existed within the Russian Empire. We see that corruption and inefficiency would also persist in these courts. Judges were still subject to political pressures from the Tsarist government and from local elites. And I guess you could make the final point that if you were to try and assess some of these reforms, not only does Alexander make some counter-reforms during this time, but when Alexander is assassinated in 1881, his son Alexander III brings an end to a lot of these liberal reforms. We see that there is a greater amount of autocracy and control over these different institutions that is reasserted by Alexander III. In terms of military reforms then, particularly after the Crimean War and the impact of it, we can see that there are a lot of reasons why Alexander II was keen to introduce new reforms to the military. So these preconditions include things like there is the inefficiency in the mobilization of troops, there is poor leadership and outdated tactics, there is low morale among ranks, there is a lot of disorganization and incompetence among the sort of logistical parts of the military unit. And so what Alexander II does is introduce a number of very important reforms, including, for example, the idea of universal conscription. This was introduced in 1874, and it mandated that all able-bodied men between the ages of 20 and 43 were subjected to compulsory military service. This is a significant departure from the previous practices where only certain social classes were conscripted. The length of military service would be reduced from 25 years to 6 years of active service, plus an additional 9 years of in the reserves. This was a more reasonable commitment compared to the previous extensive service requirements. Nevertheless, you still see that we do still see exemptions, but the reform nevertheless drastically expands the pool of potential soldiers. The broader result is that it creates a larger, more representative army that is not reliant on social classes and the landowning elite, but also tries to reflect a lot more of a structured military service. Particularly when we couple these kinds of reforms with the reorganization reforms. The Russian army was divided into a more streamlined structure, with a number of military districts being increased to ensure more efficient command and control across the vast expanse of the empire. The army would then be better equipped. You would see that training and drills would be modernized, adapting the new techniques and tactics that were inspired by the models of the French and the Prussian military systems that existed in Western Europe. There was an emphasis placed on field maneuvers, on drills, and on advanced battlefield strategies. We see an improvement in military education. Military academies were expanded and modernized, with a greater focus on practical training, on modern tactics, and a professional approach to military leadership. We see a greater improvement of officer training, with a new curricula emphasizing technical subjects and scientific subjects, emphasis placed on this idea of military science, and officers trained to think strategically, rather than on the more traditional methods. We see an introduction of new weaponry. We get an introduction of rifles, artillery, and ammunition, more in line with the Western European standards. And then we also get the creation of the reserves forces and the auxiliary forces, sort of touching on the universal conscription part, but after completing active duty, soldiers were placed in reserve forces, which could then mean that they could be quickly mobilized in times of war or times of crisis. The result was that you had a much broader base from which you can call up soldiers in the event of a conflict of eminent importance. Finally then, we have some local government reforms, the introduction of the Zemstva, for example. Now, before Alexander's reforms, local governance in Russia was highly centralized and it was very inefficient. It was very autocratic. The Tsarist state had relied heavily on an imperial bureaucracy. This was to essentially administer local aspects of government. You would have noble landowners or pomeshchiks who were responsible for managing the peasantry, often neglecting their duties, and often also under the auspices of serfdom prior to the Emancipation Edict. So in 1864, we see the introduction of the Zemstva reform, created a number of local councils called Zemstva, or Zemstvos, if we're thinking about the plural. These councils were tasked with managing local administration, and this included things like education, public health, infrastructure, and welfare. And ultimately, these elected councils then were elected at a local level. They were formed in each province and district. They represented a combination of local landowners and urban elites and other social classes. They were intended to include representatives of different social estates, such as the nobility, the townspeople, and even in some cases, the peasantry, although they were still very underrepresented. They would be elected in an indirect manner. Different social classes elected delegates to the Zemstva assemblies. The number of representatives from each group varied depending on the population. In terms of their sort of powers and responsibilities, they were given the responsibility to manage public services, including things like construction and maintenance of roads, of bridges, and other parts of infrastructure. They were in charge of organising local education, healthcare, and poor relief. They were instrumental, for example, in expanding this idea of primary education and improving public health. They would have control over the collection and the allocation of local taxes, and were responsible for managing the budgets concerned with and interconnected with the local projects. The Zemstva system was divided into two main levels. You have at the first level the provincial Zemstva, which covered an entire province, and then you have the district Zemstva, which served smaller areas within each of those provinces. Each Zemstva had what was known as an assembly, which was known as the Zemstvone Sobrani, and an executive committee known as the Pravleni. The provincial Zemstvas also had greater influence and dealt with more extensive regional matters, while the district Zemstvas were responsible for more localized issues. In terms of their impact then, on the one hand, we can see that there is a significant amount of local government and organisation within the administrative system. Rural areas, which had previously been neglected by this idea of a central bureaucracy, would see improvements in public health, they would see improvements in education. Education specifically was one of those notable successful areas for these reforms. They expanded schools, they expanded literacy programs, particularly in rural areas. The sort of critique of that and the analysis of education reforms can be in relation to, for example, the fact that these schools would still be focusing on quite a heavy amount of religious education. So the Orthodox Church still maintained quite a significant amount of authority in that particular time as well. While the Zemstva did decentralize some powers, it also created new political dynamics. And so this ties into the socio-political consequences. Over time, for example, the middle class and the intelligentsia began to play a more significant role in the Zemstva, and they used those bodies to promote progressive ideas. And this gives rise to a growing political consciousness among the more educated Russians within society. They began to advocate for broader reforms such as constitutionalism, civil rights, and political freedoms. And it should be noted that the Zemstva system's successors were not universal. Some areas did see an improvement in local education systems, for example, and sees significant progress, whereas others remained stagnant due to corruption, lack of resources, and insufficient cooperation from the central government. And this is really where we start to see the challenges. One of the major challenges is while the peasantry of each of these local areas made up the majority of the population, they still had a significant amount of limited amount of representation in the Zemstvas, as the electoral system was weighted too heavily towards landowners and the urban elites. Additionally, the Zemstvas had limited control over things like police matters and military matters, and their decisions could be overturned by higher authorities. And then finally, over time, conservative forces within Russian government, especially after the assassination of Alexander II in 1881, seeks to curtail the influence of the Zemstvas. Under Alexander III, for example, the powers of the Zemstvas were reduced, and their ability to make political changes was also severely restricted.